It's easy to focus on the pain and ask God to take it away. But we must remember that the refining process is about more than just our immediate relief. It's about the transformation that is happening within us. God is not ignoring our prayers. He is using our emotions to shape us into the people He created us to be. He is refining our character, deepening our faith, and teaching us to trust Him more. Though the process may be difficult, it is also a process of growth and change. And when we allow God to do His work in us, we emerge stronger, purer, and more aligned with His will. Feelings are powerful. They shape the way we perceive the world, the way we relate to others, and even the way we define ourselves. We often make decisions based on how we feel in the moment, whether it's about a relationship, a job, a choice to move forward in life, or whether to let go of something that's weighing us down. Our emotions can be both beautiful and overwhelming, leading us to places of great joy or deep sorrow. But here's the truth. Feelings are not facts. They are not the objective truth about who we are, where we are in life, or where we are going. They are instead indicators, temporary markers on a much larger journey that may often lead us down a path of clarity, but not always with the precision or permanence we may hope for. It's easy to get caught in the whirlwind of emotions. When our feelings rise up in us, they can seem like undeniable truths. When we are happy, we feel like the whole world is full of light and promise. When we are sad, it feels like that sadness will never end, that we are trapped in a state of despair, and that our future is bleak. Our feelings can make us believe that the way we feel in the present is a reflection of how things are or how they will always be. But feelings are not set in stone. They fluctuate. They ebb and flow like the tide, rising high one moment and retreating the next. They change as quickly as the wind, and while they are important to acknowledge, they should never be trusted as the sole foundation for our understanding of ourselves or our circumstances. One of the most important realizations we can have in life is that our emotions are not always accurate reflections of reality. Our feelings can be influenced by many factors: past experiences, fears, insecurities, or even external pressures from society or the people around us. We can be swept up by the moment and let our emotions dictate our actions, leading us to make decisions that don't align with the larger truths about who we are or what we're called to do. In these moments, we need to pause and recognize that while our emotions are real, they are not necessarily the full picture. For example, consider the feeling of anxiety. When we feel anxious, we often assume that something is wrong, that we are in danger, or that we are unprepared for what lies ahead. Our heart races, our mind starts to spiral with worst-case scenarios, and it feels like the world is closing in around us. But anxiety is not always a true reflection of the situation we are facing. It can be a response to our own fears, uncertainties, or past traumas, projecting a distorted image of what is happening in the present moment. Just because we feel anxious doesn't mean that there is an actual threat or that we are incapable of handling what is before us. Feelings of anxiety can cloud our judgment, making it harder for us to see the reality of the situation. And in turn, we may overreact or misinterpret what is truly going on. This is why it's so important to understand that feelings are not facts. Feelings are also deeply subjective. They arise from within us and are shaped by our internal world, our perceptions, and the meanings we attach to events or situations. One person might feel joy in a situation where another person feels sadness, simply because of how they interpret what's happening. For example, two people can attend the same event, and one may feel inspired and excited while the other feels overwhelmed or disconnected. The event itself is the same, but the feelings generated are different. This subjectivity of emotions means that they cannot be relied upon as definitive truths about our lives or the world around us. Just because we feel something doesn't mean that what we feel is the truth of the situation. We need to step back and evaluate our emotions in the context of the bigger picture, recognizing that feelings are temporary and can be influenced by many external and internal factors. What happens when we build our lives around our emotions, thinking that they represent the truth? We start making decisions based on the current state of our feelings rather than the facts. For instance, when we're angry, it might feel justified to lash out at someone, but that anger may not be a true reflection of the other person's actions or the situation at hand. It might just be a reaction to something deeper within us, an unresolved issue or a misunderstanding. When we act solely on how we feel, we risk making choices that don't align with our values or the bigger purpose we're striving for. We may regret those decisions later when we come to see that our feelings led us astray. This is why it is critical to recognize that while our feelings are valid and deserve to be acknowledged, they should not be the driving force behind the decisions we make in life. Feelings are fleeting. As mentioned earlier, they shift and change over time, and this is why we can't let them define who we are or what we're capable of. If we base our entire identity on how we feel at any given moment, we risk constantly changing our sense of self, depending on which emotion is dominant at the time. One day we may feel confident and strong, and the next we may feel inadequate and weak. If we let our feelings determine our identity, we will be like a ship tossed by the waves of the ocean, constantly shifting in response to the emotional tides. But our identity is not rooted in our emotions, it is rooted in something far more stable and enduring. We all face seasons of emotional highs and lows. We all experience moments when we feel completely certain about something, only to have that certainty shaken by the next wave of doubt or fear. If we were to make decisions based on every emotional shift, we would be in a constant state of confusion and instability. Instead, we must learn to view our emotions as temporary states, acknowledging them, feeling them, but not allowing them to control our actions or define who we are. Our sense of self and our choices should be grounded in the truth, not in the momentary fluctuations of emotion. Feelings are also impacted by external influences. What we feel can be shaped by the opinions of others, societal expectations, or even the media. We may feel pressured to be a certain way or act a certain way based on what the world around us deems acceptable. This pressure can create a disconnect between how we truly feel and how we think we should feel. For example, societal standards often tell us that we should be happy, successful, and confident at all times. When we don't feel this way, we can feel ashamed or inadequate, even though our true feelings are simply a reflection of where we are in life. The disconnect between our internal world and the external expectations can leave us feeling lost, especially if we base our worth on how we think we should feel. This is why it's so important to disentangle ourselves from the false belief that feelings represent the truth of our worth or abilities. The truth of who we are, what we are capable of, and what we are meant to do in life does not change based on whether we feel confident or not in any given moment. Our worth is not contingent on our emotions. It is inherent in who we are as human beings, created with purpose and value. Another area where the idea that feelings are not facts becomes clear is in relationships. Relationships are complex, and we often bring our own emotions and perceptions into them. When we feel hurt, rejected, or misunderstood, it's easy to believe that these feelings reflect the true nature of the relationship. But emotions are just one piece of the puzzle. Our feelings may be based on past experiences, fears, or insecurities that are being projected onto the relationship. We might feel disconnected or distant from someone, but those feelings may not reflect the actual dynamics of the relationship. The same can be true in romantic relationships. Feelings of doubt or insecurity may arise, leading us to question the relationship itself, even when the truth may be that those feelings are coming from within us, not from any actual problem in the relationship. This is why it's important to separate how we feel from the reality of the situation. While it's valid to feel hurt or confused, it's essential to assess the relationship based on facts, not on emotions alone. Feelings are not facts, and recognizing this truth is liberating. It gives us the freedom to evaluate our situations with clarity, to make decisions based on what is true, not just what we feel. It frees us from the tyranny of being controlled by our emotions, allowing us to live more intentionally and with purpose. We can acknowledge our feelings without letting them dictate the course of our lives. By recognizing that feelings are not facts, we learn to differentiate between our internal emotional world and the external reality in which we live. We become more grounded in the truth, and as we do so, we find greater peace, stability, and confidence in ourselves and our journey. Waiting is often regarded as one of the most difficult aspects of the human experience. It is during these times of waiting that we feel the weight of uncertainty, the burden of not knowing what comes next, and the challenge of being patient while trusting that something better is on the horizon. Whether we're waiting for a breakthrough, a healing, or an answer to prayer, the waiting period can feel agonizing and prolonged. In these moments, it is natural to ask, why the wait? Why does God make us wait? It is in these seasons of delay and pause that we can often feel our faith stretched thin. And yet, it is during these times that we experience God's grace in its most powerful and profound form. When we are in the midst of waiting, whether it's for healing from a painful loss, a new job opportunity, or the resolution of a personal struggle, it is easy to become discouraged. We can start to question whether God is hearing our prayers or if He has forgotten about us. The frustration of waiting can bring about feelings of loneliness, uncertainty, and impatience. We may feel as though we are standing still while the rest of the world moves forward. But in these moments, God's grace becomes our anchor, holding us firm in the midst of the storm. It is not that God's grace removes the waiting or makes it easier, but rather that His grace is sufficient to carry us through the waiting period, providing strength and peace in the process. The truth is that God's grace is always available to us, even when we feel like we're not moving forward or when things seem stagnant. It is easy to assume that grace is something we receive only when things are going well or when we are experiencing success. However, God's grace is not confined to moments of triumph. It is most evident in the moments when we are weak, unsure, and uncertain. His grace is most profound when we are in the waiting periods, in the gaps between where we are and where we hope to be. In these spaces, we learn that God's grace is not just for our moments of victory, but it is also for our moments of waiting, struggle, and growth. One of the most important things to remember in the waiting season is that God is never idle. He is always at work, even when we cannot see or understand His purpose. His grace is working in us during the waiting, transforming us from the inside out. The waiting period is not wasted time. It is a season of growth, maturity, and preparation. God is using this time to shape us, refine us, and build our character. He is teaching us patience, trust, and dependence on Him. While we may be waiting for something external to change, God is also changing something within us. In the Bible, we find countless examples of people who had to wait for God's promises to be fulfilled. Think about the story of Abraham and Sarah, who waited for decades for the child that was promised to them. They waited so long that they began to doubt whether God would ever fulfill His promise. Yet, in the midst of their waiting, God's grace sustained them. His grace gave them the strength to keep believing, to keep hoping, and to keep waiting, even when the circumstances seemed impossible. The waiting period was not easy, but it was in the waiting that they learned to trust God in deeper ways. And when the time came for God to fulfill His promise, they were ready to receive it. Another powerful example of God's grace in the waiting is the story of Joseph. Joseph's journey is one that was marked by long periods of waiting and uncertainty. He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, and wrongfully imprisoned. But throughout all of this, God's grace was at work in his life. Even when Joseph was in the depths of his struggles, God never left him. God used every moment of Joseph's waiting to prepare him for the incredible purpose that lay ahead. And when the time came, Joseph was elevated to a position of power and influence. but he was also able to look back at his journey with gratitude, knowing that it was God's grace that sustained him throughout his trials. These stories remind us that God's grace is not a one-time event that we experience at the beginning of our faith journey. Rather, it is an ongoing reality that sustains us through the ups and downs of life. His grace is sufficient to carry us through the waiting periods. And it is in these moments that we often experience his presence and faithfulness in the most profound ways. Waiting is not a sign of abandonment. It is an opportunity to learn to rely more fully on God's grace, to deepen our relationship with him and to grow in our faith. God's grace is also sufficient in the waiting because it helps us shift our focus from what we are waiting for to what God is doing in us during the wait. So often we become fixated on the outcome, the thing we are waiting for, and we begin to feel that our lives are on hold until that thing arrives. But the truth is that our lives are never on hold with God. He is always at work in us, shaping us, molding us, and preparing us for what's ahead. The waiting period is not a time for us to simply passively wait for something to happen. It is a time for us to actively seek God, to draw closer to him, and to allow him to work in our hearts. This shift in perspective can be life-changing. Instead of focusing solely on the end goal, we begin to see the waiting as a part of God's greater plan. We recognize that our waiting is not in vain. It is a season of preparation, growth, and transformation. God's grace allows us to have peace in the process, to trust that he is working behind the scenes, even when we cannot see the full picture. It is in the waiting that we learn to walk by faith and not by sight, to trust that God knows what is best for us, even when we can't see the outcome. In the New Testament, Paul writes about how God's grace is sufficient, even in our weakness. He speaks of a thorn in the flesh, a persistent issue that caused him great pain and frustration. Paul asked God multiple times to remove it, but God's response was clear. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. 2 Corinthians 12:9. In this moment, Paul realized that God's grace was not just for the times when he was strong or had everything together. It was sufficient even in his weakness, in his struggle, and in his waiting. God's grace didn't eliminate the pain, but it empowered Paul to endure it. It gave him the strength to press on, knowing that God was with him in the midst of it. This same grace is available to us today. God's grace is not dependent on our circumstances. It is not based on whether we are in a season of success or a season of waiting. His grace is constant, unchanging, and sufficient for every moment of our lives. When we feel weak, when we feel like we can't go on, his grace is there to lift us up and carry us through. When we feel like the waiting is too long, when the frustration threatens to overwhelm us, his grace is there to remind us that we are not alone and that he is working in us, even in the waiting. God's grace is sufficient in the waiting because it is in this space that we learn to rely on him more deeply. Waiting requires us to let go of control and trust in his timing. It requires us to have faith that God knows what is best for us and that he is working everything together for our good. In the waiting, we may not understand all the reasons behind our circumstances, but God's grace allows us to trust that he is in control. His grace gives us the strength to wait with hope, knowing that he is faithful and that he will fulfill his promises in his perfect timing. Ultimately, the waiting period is a time for us to grow in our relationship with God, to deepen our trust in his goodness, and to experience his grace in ways that we might never have experienced if we had not had to wait. Waiting can be difficult, but it is also a powerful opportunity to experience the sufficiency of God's grace. It is in the waiting that we are transformed, refined, and prepared for what God has in store. And as we wait, we can trust that his grace is sufficient to carry us through, to strengthen us, and to bring us to the place he has promised. There are moments in life when we find ourselves struggling with emotions that we just cannot shake. These feelings may be attached to someone, a person who has touched our lives in some profound way, someone we may have loved, admired, or perhaps lost. And in these moments, we find ourselves wondering why, despite our best efforts, God has not removed these feelings from our hearts and minds. Why does it seem that we cannot move on, despite praying for peace, despite asking God to take away the burden of these emotions? You see, we live in a world where emotions are part of our human experience. They are the threads that connect us to the world around us, the colors in the canvas of our relationships, and the markers that guide us through the journey of life. But emotions are also complex. And when they become tangled with another person, they can become overwhelming. This can be especially true when we've given a piece of ourselves to someone, whether in love, friendship, or even trust, only to feel as though we are left with an emotional imprint that refuses to fade. So when God doesn't remove those feelings, what do? How do we reconcile our desire for emotional release with the reality of God's silence or his seeming refusal to take those emotions from us? First, we need to understand that just because God hasn't removed the feelings, it doesn't mean he's absent. It doesn't mean he's not working on our behalf. Sometimes the answer to our prayers isn't no, but rather wait. There's a profound difference between God not answering our prayer and God answering in a way we don't understand. It's easy to mistake silence for abandonment, but God's silence often carries the weight of preparation. You see, God is not just concerned with removing the pain or the feelings we're wrestling with. He's concerned with the transformation of our hearts. He is shaping us, molding us, refining us in the very fire that feels so uncomfortable, so unbearable at times. And so we find ourselves at a crossroads. On one hand, we have the desire to be free from these emotions. We long for release, for relief, for the peace that surpasses understanding. We want to move on, to let go, to feel something else, anything else. On the other hand, there's God working on us in ways we cannot yet see, preparing us for something greater than the emotions we are currently drowning in. Perhaps God is teaching us the invaluable lesson of surrender. Perhaps he's teaching us that it's okay not to have all the answers, that it's okay to feel the pain, but to not let it define us. What we fail to realize in the midst of our emotional struggle is that feelings are not permanent. They are transient, shifting like the tides of the ocean. They rise and fall, grow and fade. But when we try to wrestle control from God and force those feelings to go away on our timetable, we only prolong the process. Instead of allowing ourselves to feel what we need to feel, we try to suppress it, to bury it, to deny it. But God's timing is perfect, and the feelings we have now are a part of his plan. He will not leave us in this state forever. It might take time and it might take patience, but he will work all things together for good in our lives. Let me remind you of something important. Feelings are not facts. Just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean that is the truth of your situation. Feelings are indicators, not dictators. They can guide us, but they should never govern us. There's a difference between acknowledging our feelings and being ruled by them. Feelings are like a gauge on a car. They let us know what's going on inside of us, but they shouldn't determine the direction we are going. When God doesn't take away your feelings for someone, it may be because he is teaching you the strength to rise above them. He wants to show you that you are more than your emotions. You are more than the person who has captured your heart. You are more than the situation that has caused you pain. It's easy to think that God's love is conditional on our emotional state, that when we feel broken, unworthy, or overwhelmed, God has somehow pulled away. But God's love doesn't hinge on how we feel. His love is constant, unchanging, and it's through the fire of our emotions that he refines us. The love that God has for us doesn't change when our feelings for someone else don't fade. He sees us not for the emotions we struggle with, but for the people we are becoming. The emotions we are experiencing are not punishment. They are a part of the refining process. And just like gold is purified by fire, so too are we refined by the emotional struggles that we face. There's a purpose in the delay. There's a purpose in the holding pattern. And though it may not make sense now, we must trust that God is at work, even when it feels like he is silent. When we're stuck in the tension of longing for something that we can't control, we are given the opportunity to trust God in ways that we never would if everything came easily. Trust is not built in the good times. It's forged in the fire. When we are pressed and we feel as though we can't go on, that's when we have the chance to discover a deeper level of trust in the Creator. We must also realize that God is not only concerned with us in the moment of struggle, but he is preparing us for the future. Perhaps the reason he hasn't removed the feelings is because he is molding us for something greater. Maybe he is strengthening our hearts for the kind of love that we've never experienced before. Maybe he is teaching us to love ourselves first before we can truly love someone else. The lessons we learn during this waiting period will serve us in ways we can't yet imagine. What we may think is a burden today may become the very thing that propels us into the next chapter of our lives. God has a plan, and it is far greater than our understanding. Let's not forget that in the process of healing, there's grace. God's grace is sufficient for us in our moments of weakness. And sometimes the only thing we can do is rest in his grace. The healing may not happen overnight, and the emotions may not fade as quickly as we want them to, but God's grace is enough to carry us through. His grace is the balm that soothes our hearts when we feel overwhelmed. And when we lean into that grace, we begin to see that we don't have to carry this burden alone. So when God doesn't remove your feelings for someone, remember this: he's not ignoring you. He's not punishing you. He's working on you. He's working in you. He's refining you. He's teaching you patience, trust, and surrender. He's showing you that you are more than your emotions and that your heart is capable of greater love, greater resilience, and greater strength than you ever thought possible. And when the time is right, he will bring healing, he will bring peace, he will bring closure. But until then, trust him. Let the feelings you hold in your heart be the very thing that draws you closer to him. Let them be the instrument that shapes you into the person he created you to be. Trust the process. He's with you every step of the way, and he's doing something beautiful in the waiting. When God doesn't remove your feelings for someone, it's not a sign of abandonment. It's an opportunity for personal growth and transformation. God uses emotional struggles to refine us, teaching us patience, trust, and resilience as we wait for his perfect timing. Emotions are transient and should not control or define us. Though feelings can guide us, they are not the truth of our situation. God's love and purpose for our lives transcend our emotions, and he calls us to rise above them and trust in his greater plan. Healing may not come immediately, but in the waiting, God's grace is enough to carry us through. Instead of resisting the emotions we feel, we should lean into his grace, knowing that he is preparing us for something greater and will bring peace and closure in his time. In life, we all face moments that challenge our emotions, leaving us feeling vulnerable, lost, or even trapped. There are experiences and relationships that come into our lives, leaving an imprint on our hearts and minds. Some of these emotions may fade with time, but others linger, causing us to wonder why we can't simply move on. We may pray fervently, asking God to remove these feelings, to take away the burden of longing, hurt, or attachment. But sometimes God doesn't immediately remove those emotions. He leaves us in the midst of the struggle. This can feel like an agonizing place to be, and we might question whether God is listening or whether he is even with us. However, in these moments, God is not absent. He is actively at work in us, shaping us, molding us, and refining us. The refining process is not easy, and it is often a painful journey. The word refining brings to mind the image of gold being purified in fire. Gold does not become pure and valuable without being subjected to intense heat, without being exposed to the flames. It is through the fire that impurities are burned away, leaving behind something pure and precious. Similarly, God often uses the emotional struggles we face to refine us. When we are caught in the grip of overwhelming emotions, whether it's love, longing, heartbreak, or confusion, it's easy to forget that there is a greater purpose in these moments. We can't always see it, and we often wish we could escape the pain, but God allows us to experience this process for our transformation. Emotions are powerful forces, and they have the ability to shape our actions and perception. However, they can also cloud our judgment and control our decisions. God knows this better than anyone, and He understands how easily we can become entrapped by our feelings. When we ask God to remove our feelings, we may be seeking immediate relief, a way to escape the emotional tension, yet in His infinite wisdom, God may choose not to remove the feelings, not because He is ignoring us, but because He knows that the process of working through those feelings will lead us to a place of deeper understanding, stronger faith, and greater maturity. In the refining process, God is teaching us to trust Him more than we trust our emotions. Our emotions are not always reliable. They shift and change with circumstances, and they can lead us astray if we allow them to dictate our decisions. God, on the other hand, is constant, unchanging, and steadfast. He is teaching us that even when our feelings are in turmoil, we can still trust His purpose and His timing. God's refining work often requires us to let go of our need for control, to surrender our desires, and to trust in His sovereignty. This surrender is not easy. It requires us to give up our desire for immediate answers and instead wait on God's perfect timing. In doing so, we allow ourselves to be molded and shaped by His hands. The refining process also teaches us to rely on God's strength rather than our own. When we are caught in a whirlwind of emotions, we can easily become overwhelmed, feeling as though we are being pulled in different directions. But God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in times of trouble. He does not leave us to navigate our emotions alone. Instead, He walks with us through the storm, providing us with the strength we need to persevere. In those moments when we feel as though we can't go on, God's grace is sufficient. His grace enables us to endure, even when the pain feels unbearable. It is through this dependence on God's strength that we begin to understand the depth of His love for us. His love is not just present in the good times. It is especially evident in our moments of struggle. God's grace is sufficient to carry us through the refining fire, and it is in those moments that we experience His power at work in us. One of the most difficult aspects of the refining process is the waiting. We live in a world that values instant gratification, where everything seems to be available at the touch of a button. We want solutions to our problems quickly, and we expect to feel better immediately. But God's ways are not our ways, and His timing is not our timing. The waiting period can feel like an eternity, especially when we are longing for emotional relief. Yet, it is in the waiting that God is doing some of His most profound work. In the waiting, He is deepening our faith, teaching us patience, and helping us to develop the character we need for the next season of our lives. Waiting requires us to trust that God is still at work, even when we can't see the results right away. It is in this process of waiting that we learn to rely on God's faithfulness, to believe that He will fulfill His promises in His perfect time. Through the refining process, God also helps us to understand that our emotions, though important, do not define us. We are not our feelings. We are not the sum of our past experiences, our hurts, or our desires. We are children of God, created in His image, and our identity is found in Him. The emotions we experience are real, but they do not have the power to control our future. As God refines us, He teaches us that we are more than the circumstances we find ourselves in. We are more than the people who have hurt us, and we are more than the feelings that try to hold us captive. God is helping us to build a foundation of truth that will sustain us when emotions threaten to overwhelm us. Another aspect of the refining process is the opportunity for personal growth. God does not waste our pain. Every struggle, every moment of heartache is an opportunity for us to grow in character and faith. The emotions that we are experiencing are not pointless. They are part of the process that God is using to shape us. When we allow God to work in us during these times, we come out stronger, more compassionate, and more dependent on Him. The challenges we face are not meant to break us. They are meant to build us up, to refine our faith, and to help us become more like Christ. We may not understand why we are going through the process, but we can trust that God is working everything together for our good. In the refining process, we are also reminded of the importance of surrender. We may try to fight against our emotions, to suppress them or push them aside, but in doing so, we are resisting the work that God is doing in us. God does not force His work upon us. He invites us to cooperate with Him in the process. Surrendering our emotions to God means allowing Him to do the work He wants to do in us, even when it's uncomfortable or painful. It means trusting that His plans for us are better than our own and that His timing is perfect. Surrender is an act of faith, a declaration that we believe God knows what is best for us, even when we don't fully understand the path He has chosen for us. Finally, we must recognize that the refining process is not a one-time event. It is a lifelong journey. We will face many trials and challenges throughout our lives, and each one will offer an opportunity for refinement. Just as gold must be refined multiple times to reach its purest form, we too will be refined throughout our lives. Each experience, each emotional struggle will contribute to the person God is shaping us to be. It's not about reaching a place of perfection. It's about becoming more like Christ, day by day. The refining process is ongoing, and we can trust that God will continue to work in us until the day we are fully made whole. When we find ourselves in the midst of emotional struggles,